second panel of the day is entitled Voicing Crisis, the Role of Leader Communication. Moderating the panel is Professor Brad Johnson. Professor Johnson is instructor here at the Naval Academy of Leadership, Ethics, and Law Department. Sir, it's all yours.
Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted that you're back for another session. This one is focused entirely on issues of communication crisis. So a couple of key questions just to be thinking about and stewing as you get to hear our panelists. How do leaders communicate behaviors, communication behaviors during a crisis make a difference for the organization, maybe for society, depending on who they're communicating to? And what do really excellent and perhaps not so excellent leaders do and say in the midst and the aftermath of crisis in order to help us move forward? So really a crisis is occurring. What do fabulous leaders actually do in terms of communicating? We are really lucky. We've got three luminaries in the area of communication and leadership here. I do need to note that Ari Fleischer didn't make it out of New York because of the storm this morning. So we've got a little bit more time for the three folks that are here. I will introduce them each very, very quickly. You've got the full bio in the program that you've got. I'll say just a few words about each, let them go ahead and get going. And I'll do them individually and let them take off. First of all, Rear Admiral Dennis Moynihan is the Chief Information Officer, Principal Spokesman for the Department of the Navy. His most recent assignments include Chief PAO for NATO's Allied Command Transformation. He's also been Director of Public Affairs for the U.S. Joint Forces Command in Norfolk, Virginia. He served at sea as Public Affairs Officer for the USS Enterprise. And perhaps importantly, he's an 86 graduate of the Naval Academy. So please help me welcome Rear Admiral Moynihan.
Thank you, Professor Johnson. 23 years ago, my claim to fame was being captain of the golf team, so to be invited back for anything, let alone be called a luminary, is quite an honor. So thank you. Again, it's a pleasure to be here. I just left the Pentagon, and so my vow to you is that I will try to operate in an acronym-free zone. So if I split one out, I'll apologize. I'll do 10 push-ups afterwards, but I'll try to keep it simple. What a great panel! I look forward to hearing what my fellow panelists have to say. I think it's a wonderful topic. I was told to keep it short, and that's good. I'm just trying to spur a little dialogue here in the Q&A. But when I think about the role of leaders in communication, I just want to talk you through four different thoughts that come immediately to mind for me. The first is tone. I think in a crisis, it's the leader who sets the tone. And how that person communicates, it trickles up and it trickles down. So if the leader's emotional, the people who work for him or her will be emotional. If the leader's calm, the people, his or her subordinates, will be calm. So I think it's the leader who sets the tone. When some folks get senior, when you operate at the 3-star admiral or general level, a lot of times people will have senior advisors or public affairs officers that work for them. I believe in a crisis that a leader cannot subcontract the responsibility of communication to his staff, his or her staff. I think it's up to the leader to set the tone, and communication belongs to the sole responsibility of the leader. People like me can help the leader, but it's up to that leader to deliver the message. After tone, I think a leader really needs to consider the frequency of his or her communication. If the leader under-communicates in a crisis, that vacuum will be filled by either naysayers, critics, people who aren't quite as informed as the leader. So there's a risk in under-communicating, just as there's a risk in over-communicating. If the leader is up on the circuit too much, some may say, hey, he's talking to TV all the time. Isn't he doing his or her job? So the frequency of communication, finding that sweet spot between under-communicating and over-communicating is very important as a leader. The third thing is alignment. With the exception of Ari Fleischer, who's not here, all of our bosses have bosses. And so as a leader, it's important that your subordinates are aligned with your tone and with your messages. And likewise, as a leader, you also need to be looking up to your superiors to see what they're communicating and making sure that you are aligned. The model that I'm familiar with is the military. So when the Chief of Naval Operations speaks, I want to make sure that his messages are aligned with the Department of Defense, the Department of State, and the White House, so that what we're saying is not misaligned with what our superiors are saying. The final thing is the means to communicate. Sounds like a cliche, and it is, but one size doesn't fit all. If we were all on a ship, we would have an announcing system where all of your audience is in one place and you just speak to this microphone and everybody gets it. Well, that's one way to do it if you're on a ship. But when you're in a more transparent or you're in an environment where there's more means to communicate, you really need to consider who your audiences are and what means you're going to use to communicate. For instance, a naval message might work great on a ship. An email might work great in some cases, but if you want to reach families, how are you going to do that? If you want to reach members of the Hill, how do you do that? So this recent Haiti crisis that we're involved in has really been very instructive for us in terms of how do we communicate those messages and what means do we use. So again, if I could leave you with anything, for me it's tone, frequency, alignment, and means. So I look forward to your questions. That's all I've got. Professor.
Excellent. I neglected to mention, as soon as we're wrapped up with these opening comments, we're simply going to be doing lots of interaction, be thinking of questions, letting those percolate a little bit, and we'll have some great interaction here. Thank you, Admiral Moynihan. Now, Mr. Paul Drabber, graduate of the Naval Academy, former nuclear submarine officer, served on the USS Pintado, currently Managing Director for Global Mergers and Acquisitions at J.P. Morgan Chase, has served as financial advisor for over $250 billion in merger and acquisitions transactions, which may be why his class at the Academy just asked him to be the head of fundraising. I just learned that. He's also been appointed by Secretary of Energy to the board that oversees all of the Department of Energy's nuclear weapons and nuclear waste sites. So I want to go ahead and ask you to welcome Mr. Drabber.
Thank you very much. It's great to be down here. I've been coming down and helping lecture for the last 12 years also in the economics department, and I love being part of this community and the community of graduates. I came down from New York yesterday, and being a banker, coming down to the Washington, D.C. vicinity is always a little bit dangerous. Don't get shot by some random bullet of the week. I think the perspective that I'm bringing here, and there's obviously a lot of the perspectives of this conference are from a lot of people who had some very serious life or death sort of situations. Mine's a little bit less than that, but still quite serious. I spend most of my day buying and selling companies, reasonably large companies by dollar amounts, and working on strategies around that in some very normal situations and some very stressful situations. And the one is probably obviously most topical and is dealing with the financial crisis that we went through last year. It was very serious because although not quite life and death, when I was in the middle of it, we were seriously looking at a Great Depression, and that's not a joke. I mean, we were sitting around the table watching things move very fast and watching basically the financial system of certainly the U.S. and ergo the whole world completely collapse around us, and it was averted, and it could have been much worse. That's kind of certainly a very important point of how do you manage through in a very complex situation with a lot of different parties, and certainly managing through a crisis like that, and communication and leadership is all very important. I was involved at my firm, which is now subsequently the largest bank in the U.S., but it wasn't because some others had some much more serious issues. And I was part of a team that was that was in an interesting position, having not participated in subprime, having not lost any money in any quarter, that we were actually in a very strong position to see the crisis, both from the negative general environment, but also from the specific of our situation of how to take advantage of the crisis, which is certainly part of this topic. And subsequently, we bought Bear Stearns and we bought Washington Mutuals, both out of bankruptcy, and participated in things that are not as widely known about the almost bankruptcy, and I personally did, about the almost bankruptcy of Morgan Stanley and Goldman Sachs the weekend after Lehman Brothers failed, which was extremely scary things that were prevented. That if those things had happened, we really would have been in another Great Depression. But I think a few introductory topics, and I think those things are very important for leaders in communicating, and within that context of my experience. Clearly, preparation, and as part of preparation, the right sort of character that you deal with on a day-to-day basis matters a lot, because when a crisis occurs and decisions had to be made, and they're part of large and complex organisms with a lot of different parties, whether internally within your organization you need to communicate with, or externally, that really is a little bit, you play the game like you practice. And I think it's really important on a day-to-day basis, which is kind of practicing for the crises that always happen in the economy. Okay, just every 4 years something happens, whether it's the internet bubble or the Asian currency crisis, or in this case, the financial crisis. The next one is emotions, and I'm not certain everyone would agree, but I think in general, the closer you are to many crises, actually worse it looks. Because you actually know more information from a communication point of view. The more that you see it, many times it's actually much worse than anyone actually really knows. And that's at least my personal experience. And one of the early emotions that you have to work through and try to manage as you try to communicate and try to address the crisis is certainly fear, and how do you overcome fear to try to do what you need to do as part of that. And certainly as part of the financial crisis, there was a lot of fear about basically everything, the whole world economy, which could have easily have collapsed. Finally, the last general point that I would make about communication internally and externally, it's communication internally many times, it should be done well, and you should be seeking other opinions, even the people at the most senior levels of organizations. If they don't seek out other opinions, and in terms of a two-way communication during a crisis, the person at the top does not have all the answers, and if that person does believe that they have all the answers, that usually sets up some significant problems and failure. But what's very interesting, at least from my point of view, which is an external communication point of view, is actually a much more complicated dialogue, because in many situations, there are certain things, whether it's a national security issue, and that there's certain pieces of information that you really shouldn't communicate because of intelligence or so on, or from the point of view of financial service companies, not to go too much into banking, but the financial service industry globally is based on trust, and that about liquidity, and people are actually going to give you the money that they said that they're going to give you the money on the telephone, on the trade, or the bank's going to give you back the money. There's lots of trust. It goes to a long degree. And if you start communicating that there is a potential problem, the run on the financial system is actually the real problem. And when I was dealing with Morgan Stanley almost going bankrupt, the real issue was that people just didn't trust them anymore, and they were going to pull all their money. So the communication of problems from an external point of view is never completely straightforward. It has to be handled kind of very carefully as you go through crises.
my wife. Mrs. Kathleen Troia, or KT McFarland, is our third presenter. She's a national security commentator and columnist. I'll mention her show here in a minute. She held security posts in the Nixon, Ford, and Reagan administrations. She received DoD's highest civilian award for her service. She was a member of the Senate Armed Service Committee's staff and Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Public Affairs and Pentagon spokesperson. KT McFarland was a weekly national security video blog on foxnews.com called DEFCON 3. And you can catch it Monday from 10 to 11. Let's go ahead and welcome KT McFarland.
I am not a Naval Academy graduate. I'm even more important. I'm the mother of a Naval Academy graduate. So for those of you who know what that means, we're experts without having to go through any of the hassles. I want to ask you, how many of you have been to an airport and your flight's been delayed? Right? Everybody's had that experience. We want to know what happens, what the human emotion does. You start looking, people start one by one going up to the desk agent and saying, what's wrong? Why is the flight late? When's it going to come? I mean, I've got a connection to make. This flight's late. What's going on? Then after about half an hour, people start getting really snarly. They start thinking, oh gosh, this idiot. Or they're starting to talk to the people next to them about, can you believe this airline? I mean, they can't even get this plane here on time. It's a sunny day. What's going on here? Well, after about an hour, you got a lynching at hand, okay? Let's take that same situation and do it a little differently. What happens if the gate agent says, I'm sorry, it's a sunny day here in Cincinnati, but it's raining in Chicago, and so our flight is half an hour late coming out of Chicago, and we're confident that it'll be here then. Well, whoa, you have a very different attitude. Or what happens if the gate agent says, through no fault of our own, the flight that you're connecting with, the flight that's coming in, had engine malfunction, and so they're repairing the engine because, after all, we really don't want to take off with a faulty engine. Well, then what do? Okay, everybody then says, well, okay, I understand, we're sort of all in this together. You go and buy a $4 Diet Coke or bottle of water, and you go and sit waiting patiently. That's leadership. Now let's fast forward this to presidential styles, okay? The president's sort of like that gate agent. Does he get you involved in the problem at hand? Are you part of the solution? Or are you just told your flight's been delayed? You want to be the first man president. And I'll give you some examples. I worked for 3 presidents and knew them well, and have probably known every president since then, with the exception of the current president. One president I did not work for, but the class of 38 who has sponsored this program knew very well, and that was President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. He was president when Pearl Harbor happened. What did he do? Within a few hours, he was on the national radio addressing the American public. Within 24 hours, he was at Congress and declared war, asked for the declaration of war. Then every week, at the time there were no flat screen TVs, there were no cable news channels, there was radio. So every week, he had a radio address. They were called fireside chats, and families all over America sat together, huddled near the radio, and the president told them what was going on in the war. He had clearly defined set of objectives. This is what we're going to do, this is how we're going to fight the war, and he was honest about what was going on. It was not good news for the first 18 months of World War II. It was one disaster after another. And he leveled with the American people and told them what was happening. So they were part of it. The other thing that administration, that the FDR's administration did, is everybody in the population got engaged. So there was a draft. Men and boys were sent overseas to fight and die. But what happened on the home front? People went, kids, 10-year-olds, went door to door collecting tin cans and rubber tires. So if you had an extra tin can from a can of beans, you washed it out and you gave it to this kid. And somewhere in the Southwest, there were piles of tin cans. We never used those tin cans. We never melted them down to make war material. All the tires that were collected, rubber, we really never even used those. We had rationing. You could only have so much sugar a week. You could only have so much meat. You certainly had gasoline rationing. But what did that do? That meant everybody in the United States was part of the war effort. So what did it do for FDR? For that first lousy 18 months of the war, it was our war. We were in it together. You know, you were giving up your gasoline, you were giving up your sugar ration that week so that the men in uniform could fight the war and we could defeat Nazism. When the victory was declared and the greatest generation, which you're going to hear all about tonight, the greatest generation won that war, what was America left with? Well, we were a country united. We were a country with shared and common values. We had defeated a common enemy. And the country that had gone into World War II, which was made up of minorities, you know, there were the Wasps, and there were the Jews, and there were the Italians, and there were the Polish. All those people went into the war as separate entities, separate identities, and they emerged from World War II as a strong nation. The greatest generation built the greatest country that's ever been known in the history of the earth. Now let's take another example of a wartime president. LBJ, Vietnam. No declaration of war. We sort of drifted into it. We drafted people, but we didn't engage the rest of the population in it. The president, no fireside chats. LBJ didn't talk about this war very much, and particularly when it started going very badly, he didn't talk about it at all. The population wasn't engaged, and it went from being America's war to LBJ's war. And then he didn't get to run for re-election because he knew he'd be defeated. He was, Richard Nixon, my boss, Richard Nixon, was elected president. Now, Nixon tried to do some outreach and some public statements, but he wasn't a particularly good communicator. And it was too late, because by then, there was a credibility gap. There was a difference between what the spin was, what the president was talking about doing, and what the American people knew was happening. And once that credibility is lost, once a president loses the trust of the American people, he never gets it back. So, what lessons do you take back from that? You have two kinds of leaders. You have one leader who defines objectives and says what the goals are. And if those objectives have to change because the situation changes, explain to the American people why those objectives have changed. Bring them along with you in that decision. The second thing is continuously engage in the public. Keep talking. Don't think because you've made one speech, everybody in the country gets it. Americans have a really short attention span. You've got to tell them again and again and again. You've got to mobilize your entire administration to go out and make the case to the American people. The third thing is spin. You know, Washington, and I'm sure actually because of the fact that you're here, most of you either plan to be military officers or members of Congress or the Senate, or some of you probably even harbor the thought you're going to run for president. Well, Washington, when you get there, is a city of spin. There's never any bad news. That's a big mistake, because there always is bad news. And as one of the previous panelists said, admit if you've made a mistake. Talk about it. Explain why things have gone wrong and how you're going to fix it. Because again, if you keep spinning the story, and it has a big difference between the truth, you will have a credibility gap, you will lose the trust of the American people, and you will never get it back. And finally, it's important to rise above partisanship. FDR did it. Other presidents have not. Because at the end of the day, stop whining. It may have happened on a previous watch, but you got to deal with it. So at the end, when you think about what kind of leaders you're going to be, and I assume that you're all going to be great leaders, think about the choice that you make. Because success stories don't happen by accident. They happen because leaders engage their people. Leaders take responsibility. Leaders don't spin beyond all belief. And at the end, what they do is you have a situation like the greatest generation had, where you emerge from the crisis with a unified people who feel a strong sense of shared values, having gone through a shared crisis to a shared victory. Because you don't want the result that we had after Vietnam, where there's a cynicism and a distrust of government and a sense that America's adrift. So the choice is yours. I hope when you have your moment, because you all will have it, you make the right choice. Thank you.
We have got microphones on both sides, and I think if you've been here this morning, you kind of know the drill, so feel free to come on up and think of questions. You can direct them preferably to one of the panelists, but if I have a hunch various panelists will want to jump in. So why don't we go ahead right over here, lead us off.
Hi, I'm Phil Carter, American University. I consider myself a fairly good communicator. That's what I base a lot of my leadership on. I was wondering if you could me and other people some hints on how to hone these abilities over the years, and what are the best ways and the best skills to hone.
Any of you specifically would like to jump in with that?
The only thing I would say is, it's really easy to talk for 2 pages. It's really hard to talk for about 2 paragraphs. And whatever speech you're ever going to do, whatever communication you're ever going to make it shorter. It'll always be more effective.
I know there's a lot of focus here at the Academy and diversity, and diversity is very important, but I think it's really important to understand to really study and understand who's going to be your audience, right? I do a lot of work for the state of France, and believe me, when I go to the LC Palace, a set of issues around what are their issues, and ergo what I need to communicate with them is completely different than when I'm dealing with the chief of staff of the president of France versus, going and visiting, my CEO, right, Jamie Dimon. It's completely different. So I think it's really important as you think through that is to expand and have awareness of who your counterpart is, because it's completely different of how you do that with a diverse set of people you're going to deal with.
I've got in DC, but as a leader, you're going to want to. You could be prone to telling people what they want to hear, and I'm not sure that you're doing yourself or that person a huge justice. So, to me, it's always been being truthful and having hard conversations when you need to have hard conversations, because that gets to the second T, which is trust. The other panelists made use trust in both of their presentations, and one of the things that our Chief of Naval Operations says is when a crisis strikes, you can't surge trust, or it's a Navy term for bringing it forward when you need it. Trust is something that needs to be developed every single day before a crisis hits. And I think when you think about communication, we're talking about crises, but I think we can bring that forward to how we conduct ourselves as leaders. And it's through speaking the truth that you can develop trust. And when it needs to be surged and you need your team around you, you've gotten there because of the way you conducted yourself.
Great. All right. Why don't we go to this side over here?
Good afternoon. My name is First Class Adam Stanek from the Coast Guard Academy. And my question is for Admiral Moynihan. Recently, for the first time in the Coast Guard, our Commandant Admiral Allen has used different forms of social media on the internet, such as Facebook and blogging, to increase communication in our organization. And I was wondering, in your opinion, how this fit into this new forms of internet communication with the balance between over-communicating and under-communicating that you spoke about.
Thanks, Adam. Social media is one of those means that I was talking about in the last presentation. I think it's an environment, it's a way to communicate that I don't think leaders have the luxury of neglecting anymore. That is really demonstrating itself here as we communicate about what we're doing and the support that we're giving to Haiti. That's just one example. But I think social media it's just part of the fabric now, and you think about a year or so ago, you may have had a choice as to whether or not you wanted to engage, but at least that's where I was intellectually, but I'm not there anymore. You've got to be there. The other thing about social media is we can't all jump to that side of the boat. I can use a Coast Guard analogy. We need to stay balanced, and that can't be the only way that we communicate. Gallup is doing some work as to how people right now are getting their news about Haiti, and about 14% of them are getting it through social media. 88% of them are still getting their media, their information through news. So again, I've got some people in the communication industry that are rushing over to social media, and that's good to be there, but I think it needs to be balanced with other forms of communication as well. Does that answer your question?
Yes, sir.
Okay, go ahead.
My name is Dylan Young from Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. Thank you, guys. My question is kind of open-ended. For a leader, do you find it more important to have someone who's more charismatic and who can really reach out to the people, or someone who's a decision maker? Because lots of writers have talked about it being a really positive attribute to be able to inspire people and get them to work together, or it can also be dangerous for people who can manipulate, get people to do negative things.
I think, if I can answer that, I think the greatest president I worked for was somebody who did both, and that's where you really want to be. It shouldn't be an either or, because if it is, you're going to have a real gap one way or another. And that was Reagan, where he was a terrific communicator, but he was also a very decisive leader. If you, I would write speeches for Reagan, and one of the things I would look for when I would get the draft back that he had edited out is he was always simplifying. He knew how to make something really complicated, but he also had the ability to make it simple so that he could communicate it to the average guy in the street who really didn't have all day to listen to the speech. So I think it's important for any leader, especially if you get to be in the Oval Office, clearly, is to have that ability to communicate and have the ability to make decisions. Because if you can make decisions but you can't communicate, forget it, you've lost that. And if you can communicate but you can't make decisions, well, both of those are prescriptions for disaster.
Elizabeth?
Yeah, I mean, in the private sector, which is a bit different from the public side, and having to have to kind of, you do have to kind of appeal to kind of everybody, given the politics nature of it. I think within private organizations, although I agree that both are important, I think I think the more important one is the former, which is the tough and the right decisions. Because if you're part of I'm at an institution that's almost as large as the Marine Corps in terms of numbers of people, and the leader of our organization, who's certainly well known and is on TV periodically, but we all have a great degree of confidence that he is making the right decisions. And the tough decisions, it may not be the easiest one, or following the crowd, or things like that, but there's a great deal of confidence that you may not know everything of what the leader is thinking through and all the information that they may have. And I think of people in leadership positions, that's always the case, that they can't everything that they're thinking about for various reasons. But if you have a great degree of confidence that they're going to make the right and potentially tough decisions on a day-to-day basis, then when the challenge comes up, you have a great degree of confidence in that challenge that they're going to make that decision.
Dylan asked a question, but I'll open it up to the majority of the audience as I look out. A lot of folks that, as Ms. McFarland said, you're going to be leaders. And you raised a good question about, do you need to be a decision maker, or do you need to be charismatic? I think you really need to think through that. And I'm not saying that you all need to be charismatic if that's not your style. The only thing that I would ask you to consider is, whoever you are, start thinking about who you are as a communicator and how you can improve. And to me, it's not always about who's the most charismatic, who can give the greatest speech, but to me it's about who can be the most credible. So you don't have to be Ronald Reagan. You don't have to be the world's greatest speech giver to be a good leader. But you do need to be credible, and that takes on so many different forms.
Hi, my name is Crystal Craycraft, and I'm from the McDonough Leadership Program at Marietta College. And my question kind of goes along with what we've been talking about. Recently at our campus there has been what I would call a crisis. There's some kind of sickness or virus going around where 50+ students are being admitted to the hospital, and extreme numbers of students are getting sick. And I feel that our administration is withholding information from us to prevent panic and to prevent chaos on campus. So my question is, where is the line between informing the people and scaring the people?
Well, there's a classic case study that I'm not certain how many of you know, but about what the Tylenol scare that took place about, or 30 years ago now or so. And it sounds somewhat similar to that point, in which you had, a very large organization that was making a lot of money, that had a lot of healthcare scare where people were dying because someone had come along and put poison in their product. And so there were a lot of different pressures, right, on that organization. And there's a great case study about how Tylenol just let, from a communication point of view, kind of let it all out. They just completely decided to completely be transparent about every little piece about what was going on. They made the hard decision, which in that case was withdrawing everything from all the products from the market and starting completely from scratch. And they decided to completely retool their product to make certain it wouldn't happen again. I mean, they went all the way to the end. Was that an easy decision to make? Right? Of course, it was the right decision to make. But if someone didn't have the right character, the trust, and so on, someone might have tried to dig in and try to be a little bit more tactical about this and communicating, a little bit less, because it would have protected themselves. And I'm not certain what the specifics are of what you're dealing with, but it's certainly easy to see how people may try to be defensive, right, in that context. But at the end of the day, there's lots of great cases, of things in which being transparent and taking the bullet and doing the right thing usually ends up in the right place.
I had 3 thoughts. I think if you work backwards before that crisis, if it was an administration that the student body trusted or they had credibility with, I think that crisis might play differently. It just all depends on how much trust had been surged, before the crisis. Number 2, I think in a bureaucracy, perfection oftentimes becomes the enemy of good enough. There's a desire to get the whole issue suitcased and get all the data and have it perfect so that we can explain to you everything that we knew was going on. And what oftentimes happens is we get late to an issue, and that leads to breakdowns. And so as leaders, just remember that. Don't wait till you get the whole story. Tell people what you know. Tell people what you can go to the bank with. And don't wait, because that will lead to questions about why are you hiding this from me. And in terms of paranoia or, are they scaring us, I think that's a decision that you've got to leave to your consumer, to your audience. I mean, you got to trust that they're smart enough to know the difference, and just give them the facts and don't spin it.
Hi, my name is Lucia Schaefer. I'm also from Christopher Newport University in Newport News, Virginia. We do a lot of gender studies in our program, looking at the differences between male and female leadership and communication tactics. And I was wondering, what are some of your suggestions for communication strategies for specifically women in positions of leadership when dealing with men versus women followers?
I guess that's for me, right? There's a huge difference, and don't let anybody tell you there isn't. I ran for the United States Senate 2 years ago, in 2006 from New York, and I went all around New York State campaigning. And I would have women would come up to me and ask me questions in a very different way than the men would. The men would say, what's your policy on the Iraq War, or what's your policy on this or that? Women would come up, in fact, they would usually follow me to the ladies' room, and they would ask things like, my son has just come back from Iraq, and he's behaving in a really strange way. Or they would say, my son-in-law has just come back with the 10th Mountain Division in Fort Drum, upstate New York, and he's drinking a lot. What should I do? Okay, what they were doing was they were talking to me about their feelings about the Iraq War. But they weren't asking it in the same way. They were asking the question in a very different way. Now, if I had responded, well, anyway, I lost, so maybe I didn't do it very well, but I was running against Hillary, so I kind of forgive myself for that one. But I think that, you want to make sure that the way you respond is the way the question has been asked. If it's been asked in a very personal way, you should answer in a personal way. But the other thing, which is I think a more important thing for a woman who's going into this field, any field, when I started becoming an expert on national security, when I was writing my PhD at MIT on nuclear weapons, you could count on one hand the number of women who were in that field, in the national security field. When I went to the Pentagon, I had the civilian equivalent rank of a 3-star general. Well, my military assistant, who had never worked with, much less for a woman, I said, gee, are you having a hard time with this, or what do you think? He said, oh no ma'am, here at the Pentagon it's okay. I mean, he said, I worked with 3-star generals before. I worked for, drunk 3-star generals. I worked for smart 3-star generals. I worked for stupid 3-star generals. You're just not a 3-star general, I know how to treat you. Most of the time you'll go into a work time situation and that will not be the case. And as a woman, you've got to figure out your own leadership style. What works best for you? Does it work best for you to be always to the point, always businesslike? Does it work best for you to be one of the guys? That's actually the worst kind of thing you want to be as a leader. But you have to find a way, and every woman is different, to find a way to be a professional and to be there on the merits and to have your work be judged on the merits, but at the same time not lose track of who you are. So I'm proud to tell you, I'm a mother of 5, and that was probably the hardest job I've ever had. But I go toe-to-toe with anybody who wants to argue with me about nuclear weapons policy. And I hope that just understand the fact that it's a terrific time to be a woman because you can have it all. Okay? You go, girl.
Good afternoon. My name is Mitch.
I wanted to follow up on that.
Good afternoon. I'm first class Brock McQueen from North Carolina State University, and my question is addressed to you, Rear Admiral. In an international environment, especially like NATO, how do you address communication problems in a crisis such as Haiti or tsunami or any event where NATO may be called up?
Great question. And as you were asking it, it was just a blind spot. It was something I didn't think of, but I think it's the reason why we have Tuesdays. With the international, when you're dealing in an international environment, when you look at it publicly, you have to make sure that we have mostly U.S. people here in the room. We got to make sure we don't come in muscles ablazing. In situations like this, we can't go alone. It's just not who we should be, and you need to be aware of your other audiences, and you need to make sure that we've got a proper role defined and communicated. But let me talk about, as leaders, dealing in an international environment. I just left NATO, and I had 2 hats. I had a U.S. hat where I worked for a combatant commander, and I had a NATO responsibility. So I had a U.S. job and a NATO job. And in my U.S. job, 98% of us in this room are probably type A's, right? So there's one way that, when you're a type A, you got to get things done. You got a checklist, you go by your checklist, you work it. That's how I would work in my U.S. environment. And then when I would go over to NATO, that approach did not work at all. And they would say, well, let's go for coffee. I'm like, well, wait, I don't drink coffee. And hey, we're supposed to be working. Well, that's when the work gets done. In different cultures, knowing their pace, knowing their rhythm, and knowing how they communicate. So please, as you walk out of here as leaders and thinking about communication, understand who you're working with and how they do business. And your way of doing business is not always how they do business. And your way of doing it is not necessarily better than theirs. It's just different.
One second, let me just my name is Grant Mellon. I'm from the University of Pennsylvania. Ms. McFarland, you talked about the credibility gap within wartime settings, but my question is actually addressed to Mr. Drabber. Within the financial institution, correct me if I'm wrong, there's a credibility gap there right now. And right now, Mr. McFarland talked about us and going forward how we can it wouldn't be the same for us, how we cannot have this credibility gap for ourselves. But right now, how would you handle, your situation for your company and other situations for other financial institutions in terms of reconciling this gap and moving towards more trust with the American people?
You know, it's a very topical question, and you know, the financial industry was completely messed up, and there deserves to be a lot of changes required. And there are certain people within the spectrum of the financial industry versus politics where things kind of get very mushy because people have other agendas than doing what's the right thing. And that's the challenge, I think, around communications. There's some people in the financial industry who have given up trying to communicate. Okay? You know why? Because they know that when they show up in Washington or they show up in London, that someone has to be the bad person, okay, for the politicians. And there's some people who've already decided that they've lost. Okay, and I'm not saying it's the right decision, but that's the conclusion that they've reached. And they're just going to sit there and take it the best that they can and not engage. Now, I'm not saying it's the right thing, but I'm saying you just have to watch the television. There's some very specific things that happened last week where you can see where that's a decision that's been made at some very large institutions. There's other institutions like mine, which is in a very strange situation, and it's very hard to try to do what you said. Okay, let me just explain to you the sort of thing that we're dealing with. Okay, I'm working at an institution in which my colleagues were all from, a lot of them were from Chicago. They all supported the president when he was a state senator. One of my colleagues is Bill Daley, who's the former Commerce Secretary and brother of the mayor and all that other stuff. We didn't lose any money. We're about as good as it gets in the financial industry in terms of, you know, pointing fingers, and very well connected, as I just described. You know, the proposals that came out this last week were clearly about the financial industry, were actually the most targeted at the institutions that are doing the best, not the worst. TARP was spent for the car companies to a large degree. That's where most of the loss is going to be. And so here we are as an institution trying to figure out how to communicate with a group of people who have completely other agendas in a public setting, but we're just trying to run our business for our clients, try to keep lending money. We're the biggest lenders in the country. Just try to keep doing our business. And trying to figure out what to do from a communication point of view when there's a lot of different agendas going on, when in theory we did everything that we were asked to do in terms of bailing out Bear Stearns and Washington Mutual. It's not easy. Okay, you're saying, like, what can we do better? It's not easy in that context. And so what we've decided is to continue to engage and to continue to communicate, notwithstanding that there's a lot of other stakeholders who have some things that they are just going to try to use against us just because of their own purposes. So it's not pretty. These things, many times are a great challenge, and some people decide to retreat because they think they can never win, and some people try to keep engaged even though it's incredibly painful. So I don't know if I answered your question, but your question's a good one, and it's something that, you know, every week, frankly, it seems to change.
It just seems like from what Mrs. McFarland talked about with LBJ and also FDR, that a lot of the same things can be transitioned into the financial world in terms of like letting, especially for your company, you know how highly you speak of them, letting, you know, just like the normal person know more about what's going on. It just seems like, I mean, for many of us who know what's going on, for many of the people out in this world that aren't as up to date in terms of what's going on, just to continue with the communication, I think we all want to do.
Yeah, it's, I would repeat what Katie said. You know, there's a tremendous amount of information out there in the world now in terms of communication. Actually, some of the problems is that, you know, it's not being communicated. It's actually trying to sift your way through it, because some things are being said over and over and over again, and if you're not following certain things, it's easy to lose it because there's too many other people saying the same thing over again about other topics. And I think that's one of the challenges. There's a tremendous amount of volume about what happened in the financial industry, and the problem is that, you know, you can only find one book, right? That may describe a specific situation that happened, because that one reporter happened to find it, and it gets lost. And I think that's one of the challenges around communication, is that sometimes there is important information that's out there, but it gets lost in the message. And I see that, frankly, not only from a public point of view, but from an internal point of view, too.
Good afternoon. My name is Christian Yu, midshipman 4th class, Harvard University. My question is directed to you, Ms. McFarland. You spoke earlier of the home front effort during World War II, in which American citizens were thoroughly engaged with the wartime effort. In your opinion, do you think that this type of engagement between American citizens and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan could be encouraged to a greater extent? And if so, who should take the leadership in spurring this encouragement?
It's a great question, and if you can figure out the answer to that one, I think you can immediately skip Harvard, skip graduate school, and go right to the White House. Here's the problem. I think the Bush administration lost an enormous opportunity. September 11th, I was in New York. I watched the first tower go down, and I watched my city of New York, where people don't even wait for the light to turn because they're so impatient. They dash right across the street. All of a sudden, New York was waiting. New York was waiting to say, how can we do it? I mean, people lined up for 5 or 6 hours to give blood, and there was nobody to take, there were no survivors. And so what the president should have done at that point, September 12th, first of all, he should have got right on the radio, right on the television, and made the case immediately that we've been attacked. And even if he had to say, we've been attacked and I'll get back to you tomorrow with more news, he should have immediately taken leadership of that situation. The other thing he should have done, though, is understand that the American public wanted to do something. If you have a group of people who are frustrated, angry, scared, give them something to do. They want to be part of the solution. And yet, at the time, we were all told to go shopping. Well, that was not a great use of the American public. If the American public had been engaged, even something like coat drives for little kids in the hills of Afghanistan would have been a great idea. I personally think war bonds would have been a very good idea. But the fact that there was an attempt initially to not engage the public, to basically say to the public, we'll take it from here, you guys just go shopping, that was a lost opportunity. Now, what happened as a result? So here we are 8 years later. You can't get that trust back. If he had gotten that trust initially, it would have sustained the American effort through bad times, because you always have bad times. And if you have that reservoir of goodwill built up because it's our war, not his war, then you get through that. Now, can you ever reconstruct it? I think one of the great examples in today of how to really handle getting the American public involved is General Petraeus. He's a friend of mine. I interviewed him for my show on Friday. And I've got to tell you, there's somebody who went into a situation in Iraq which was a disaster. And he was frank when he testified before congressional committees. He didn't spin a thing. He said, we don't know how it's going to turn out. We just know that the Iraq surge, is the best effort we can make right now. And when he came back 6 months later for his congressional hearings, and they said, well, so what's the progress? And he said, we made some modest progress. We're going to keep on with this. On Friday, when I asked him, well, what's the situation in Iraq today? It's been a great success. And he said, it's been a modest success. We're not sure. We're pulling out of the cities. We're not going, but he didn't oversell it. And we've been oversold on Afghanistan and Iraq for 7 years. And so the example you should use is somebody like Petraeus, who tells it exactly like it is. He doesn't overstate the case. He's got you with him in the decision-making process. And we don't know how it's going to turn out. He'll be the first one to tell you that. So that's the example, I think, that's the one that I would take from your generation, where you can actually look and see on the evening news who's doing it right and who's doing it wrong. Petraeus is doing it right.
Thank you.
Sorry. My name is Steve, and I'm from American University in Washington, D.C. I want to thank you all for being here and taking time to speak with us today, and the Naval Academy for being such wonderful hosts. A similar question. Ms. McFarland, you spoke about shared sacrifice in World War II. I was wondering what you think right now in 2010 we can do nationally as citizens and locally as leaders to share burdens and work together towards a common purpose. I was wondering what you and the other panelists thought about that.
Well, I think you're going to be asked to do a lot of sacrificing, and we are. You know, we are now in a tough economic time. 1 out of every 6 people doesn't have a job. I'm sure you all have friends who graduated last year or the year before who have very big college loans and can't get jobs, right? So we need a national leader. I hope it's the president who has enormous communication skills, can rally the people around a common good. What I worry about, though, when I listen to anybody from Wall Street talking about it, or if you just watch a lot of the national debate right now, the healthcare debate, whatever, and without getting political about it, what worries me is that we seem to be pitting one group of people against another. You know, there's the labor unions over here, there's the bankers over here, there's Wall Street, there's Main Street, and everybody's sort of fighting for a piece of the pie instead of this notion that we're in this together. Because the 2 values we should take away from a crisis like this are we're in it together, that's the premise of this country, and that we're all treated equally under the law. And so if there's any sense that those nice people from Nebraska and the Cornhusker kickback, or the people from Louisiana, I think there are a few people from Louisiana Purchase, where that vote was bought, that I think that it does, whatever it may do politically, Republican, Democrat, conservative, liberal, what it does is it rips apart the fabric of this country. That we need to continue to focus on the fact that there are 2 fundamental premises of the United States of America. We're in it together, and we're all equal under the law.
Yeah, I mean, the communication that comes in the public context has implications. And let me give you, I deal with a lot of companies around the country on strategy and direction. And, you know, jobs comes up. And basically, the people who actually make things in this country and actually really hire people and pay the taxes and pay the bills for everything else are getting pummeled by very negative kind of communication points that Katie was bringing up. If you work in an oil and gas company, you're a bad person, right? If you work in the healthcare industry right now, you're a bad person. You work in a bank, you're a bad person. You work in an insurance company, you're a bad person. You work in an auto company, you've destroyed everything, for that. So I can go through industry by industry, and the communications that are being said from all these different groups, right, in this totality, is actually causing people who want to grow, right, who want to, go hire people and want to do well and, want the country to do better, are all afraid. They're actually all afraid. People who are actually running these businesses are just afraid because of this communication point that's kind of milling around, and it depends on the week, it changes, right? It's just one industry after the next that gets kind of whacked by one of these forces. And so I think it's not that complicated. As long as this is continuing, it's going to be a lot harder for the bills to be paid if you're working for the military through taxes. For those of you here who go to a non-military university, it's going to be that much harder for you to find that job, right? When you graduate, until actually people start feeling okay. And a large part of that right now is actually communications that are negative that are going on right now.
My take's a little different, and it may not make any sense, but when I first wrote the question down, you asked about shared sacrifice. And this might get a little emotional for me, but if you're in a uniform right now, your future's pretty much determined for at least the first 3, 4, 5 years. But for those of you who aren't, you talk about shared sacrifice. I think service takes on a lot of different forms. And so if you got a uniform on, that's one type of service. But I think if you're in this room, there's a pretty darn good chance you're going to be a leader. So what are you going to do with this? We can all help. You can help, by sharing your sacrifice and just going out and deciding to serve, I was a child of the 80s, so if I went home and told my parents I was going to go work for an NGO, first of all, they wouldn't know what an NGO was, and second of all, they're like, wow, you didn't want to work on Wall Street or you didn't want to go serve in the Navy? But man, if my 6-year-old daughter wanted to go work for an NGO or go serve on the Hill and not make a lot of money, it doesn't matter. It's all about just giving a little bit back, you know, and it'll all come back to you. So, I don't know if that was a wacky take.
Can I add one more thing to it? I think that this is probably the only time in the last 25 years that we could have a national service, and I'm a big believer in that. That the president could say, okay, most of you 22-year-olds can't get a job anyway, so why don't we have, well, this is a great time to have mandatory national service. Not a draft, not military service, but everybody in this country, when you reach the age of 18, 19, 20, 21, give 18 months to your country. Now, whether that's to go to a national park and paint benches, whether it's to go serve in the military, whether it's to go teach in the inner cities, that would be probably the single best investment in America's future that we can make right now, is to reinstate that sense, because we're forcing people to do it, that we are in this together. And I certainly hope that, you know, the leadership in Washington, which clearly has an awful lot of other things to worry about right now, this would be a really great idea and a good time to do it, because in the last 25 years, you know, go teach in the inner city or go work at J.P. Morgan, you know, come on, who wants to go work in the inner city? But this would be a great opportunity to sort of stamp up all of those unemployed young men and women and get them to serve their country.
Hello, my name is Spencer D. Phillips from Bucknell University. Mr. Moynihan mentioned suitcase information, and I think we've seen a lot of that over the course of the last 7 years, going back to the Iraq War and fast forwarding to the financial crisis, and now this healthcare bill that's being passed. And I was curious as to what you attribute that suitcase information to. Is it a failure on America's leaders, the confusion of mass media, or a lack of general caring on behalf of the American public?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I love how word boomerang back at me, but that's good. I don't attribute it to any sinister intent or political intent by any means. I just kind of think it's human nature. If you have a boss, you're working in a job, you got a problem, you don't want to just vomit problems on your boss's desk. You want to try to seek to understand the problem and detail why it happened, how it happened, and bring forward a solution. So you can fast forward that to different levels of bureaucracy, and it's no different. We want to understand it, we want to answer it, we want to know what the issues are, and we want to present a way forward. So I hate to cop out on you, but I think it's just an extension of human nature. We want to get the whole thing together.
Hello, my name is Nick Wendrenovich. I'm from the Professional Leadership Program at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. And I've always been told in communication that 80 to 90% of what we're trying to say is conveyed by our body language and our tone. So with the advent and rise of Twitter, Facebook, texting, how can we regain that 80 to 90% of the message we are losing?
I think as the Admiral said earlier, that it's important that different types of communication are done in different circumstances. Okay, so I'll give an example. I'm working on a transaction right now, trying to buy a very large business. It is a very complicated business with many different aspects to it. That we have about 500 people doing modeling and valuation just on our side on it. We uncover all sorts of random things on it that you know, in the course of our research about whether to buy the company or not, that are some are very big issues that are negative and some are very minor issues. And it is very easy for myself to pull out my BlackBerry and communicate on, well, this is a minor point and so on. But trying to communicate big issues through social media or email or attachments and documents and stuff like that versus still the in-person issues when they become what I call the really important ones. You have to show judgment, right, in the type of communication, given the type of message and the importance of the message. And notwithstanding all the communication tools that we have, there's absolutely times in which, that it is important for me to get into the room and see the whites of the other person's eyes and how we're going to handle this or that issue in order to get it handled.
Can I just jump in and say that I think that with all the multimedia that we have, it's important to use them all. Because it's gone are the days when there were three networks and everybody got their evening news in that 30-minute period between 7 and 7:30 every night from ABC, CBS, or NBC. So it's important to be facile and to be present in all of those meetings. There are plenty of people, and I'm sure you know them, their only brush with the evening news is what they see on Jon Stewart. There are plenty of people who, they don't communicate unless it's in however many bytes it is for Twitter. So if you want to get your message out, you need to Facebook, you need to Twitter. Prior to coming to this event today, I put it on my Facebook account, I Twittered it, and then I have a blog of about 5,000 people that I say, I'm going to be on Hannity tonight. And so I send it out there. Now, that's how you need to communicate with people. You need to be able to do it on television, you need to be able to do it on radio, and you need to be present in all the social media, because the one fact about everybody under the age of 25 is nobody has a landline phone anymore, right? They're dinosaurs, those landline phones. And the only people who buy flat screen TVs when they get out of college are guys who want to watch the Super Bowl. Everybody else is getting their communication either from their computer or their cell phone, and that's where you want to be too. But you also have to be good at the other stuff.
Thank you.
Looks like this may be our final question for today, and we'll be right on in terms of time. So go ahead.
Great, thank you. Kathleen Wilson from Tufts University. So we talked earlier today about tone, and President Obama has lately been criticized for a tone of indecisiveness and his strategy as regards the war in Afghanistan. We began in March 2009 with what was the grand strategy, with the release of the McChrystal report in August, and then we were essentially told to wait patient until the December 1st speech of 2009 for the grand strategy to be revealed. So I guess my question is, how does a leader try to balance the need to bring in information from all of your sources, utilizing your generals who are on the ground with the top information, with this need to be decisive and this need to communicate openly with the American public, and try to avoid the situation of looking like you don't actually have control over such an important policy initiative?
If I were president, I would give one advice I would give to anybody who's a new president is to do something really decisive in about the first 6 months. Probably the first 3 months. Fire somebody. That's always good because it scares everybody else in your administration into behaving. The second thing you want to do is say somebody like Reagan. Reagan's presidency was defined when, early on in his presidency, all the air traffic controllers went on strike. That meant no planes were flying. So Reagan calls up his Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, and says, I'm going to fire all those guys because they're running an illegal strike. What can we do about this? Do you have any air traffic controllers in the Army and the Navy and the Marine Corps and the Air Force? And Weinberger said, oh sure, we have the Guard and Reserve, we have a lot of air traffic controller ability. Reagan said, great. The next day, he fired all of those air traffic controllers who were out on an illegal strike. And the American Airlines system continued just fine. In fact, probably was even better because they had better trained people who were from the armed services who were directing our air traffic control. But what that did was it set Reagan up as a really strong leader. He could have flubbed a lot of stuff after that. But once he decisively laid down the gauntlet, and as somebody who takes decisive action, explains to the American people why he does it, and has a solution, he was in great shape after that. So that would be my quick bit of advice is every now and then when you get that job, fire somebody right away, hopefully for cause, and make a decisive decision where you give them the problem, you give them the solution, and you figure out how to get it done. Yeah, now.
No, I started by saying it was cool to be the golf captain, but it's even cooler to be an admiral, so I'm going to let that one go. Good.
No, I mean, I would agree. I mean, I think it's important that notwithstanding you have people maybe telling you that, this is, this or that's a right thing to do, that you need to have your own convictions, your own kind of view, and be able to communicate it and implement it. I remember when, a few years ago, when there were some people in my institution who said, doing subprime is just fine. Loans, and we can put it in what's called SIVs, which is a separative investment vehicle, which basically said it's not really my investment anymore. And all the accountants and the lawyers, from the outside were saying it's just fine. You can do that, and that's going to be okay legally and from accounting. Well, when my boss Jamie Diamond showed up, he said, "I don't believe you." Okay, all the experts are telling me that's just fine, right? And by the way, everyone else is doing it. Don't you love that as an excuse? That everyone else is doing it. They can't fry us all, right? But every once in a while they do fry you all, don't they? And sorry, that's an easy joke, Chris. But I think the reality is you need to take your own advice sometimes. And forget about the experts and make the right decisions, notwithstanding what other data is out there to the contrary.
I'll tiptoe into this one and just say that, when you're a leader, you're just going to have to make some really hard decisions, And hard is a relative term, but I think probably the hardest decision you have to make is to send somebody into harm's way knowing that person might not come back. So, we're all going to be faced maybe with those kind of decisions, maybe something a little less crucial than that, but sometimes you got to take your time. And you got to look at it from a lot of different points of view, because with some decisions you don't get a chance to get them back. So I'm okay with making sure that before you do something, you've thought long and hard about it, because in the end, it's that person that's got to stand in that call.
Yes. All right. Well, I hope this has been enriching. I hope you're sort of percolating a bit when it comes to issues of how to communicate and what that implies for you as a leader. I would like you to join me in thanking Mr. McFarland, Mr. Drabber, and Admiral Moynihan.
I'd like to once again thank all of our panelists. I actually thought that was a fantastic panel. Hope everyone did too. On behalf of the leadership staff at the Naval Academy, I'd like to present you with these gifts as a token of our appreciation, and thank you again for being with us today.